The battleship followed closely behind two great aircraft carriers on a calm autumn day, anticipating battle the following morning. The morning sun glinted against the Pacific Ocean, illuminating aircraft incoming. Bomb after bomb was dropped, and yet the battleship remained afloat. So, how was this great ship sunk, and what became of her? Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for our younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. Ise, named after the Ise province in Japan, was first ordered on April 11, 1913, and she was to be the lead ship of her class. The Ise-class battleships were intended to be an improved version of the pre-existing Fuso class. She'd be built by Kawasaki in their Kobe shipyard, being laid down on May 10, 1915. Before we get much further into her story, let's look at her specs. Ise was a battleship that displaced 42,001 long tons deep loaded, and this is after her first reconstruction. We're going off her specs after the 1934 to 1937 reconstruction because the majority of her fighting career takes place during this time period. She was 708 feet long, had a beam of 104 feet 2 inches wide, and a draft of 31 feet deep. Her complement averaged 1,366 officers and enlisted. As for propulsion, the ship was equipped with 8 water tube boilers capable of producing 80,000 horsepower. This powered 2 steam turbine sets that turned 4 propeller shafts. With this setup, she could reach speeds of 24.5 knots and had a range of 7,870 nautical miles at 16 knots. We'll get into her life as a pseudo-carrier after that refit later. For now, let's look at her armor and armament after 1934. Starting with armor, she had deck armor that was 6 inches thick to protect against air attack. She also had belt armor that was 11.8 inches thick and turret armor that was 10 inches thick. After this first reconstruction, she did have 1 aviation catapult and could carry 3 aircraft. She also had a gunnery director after her completion. In the late 1920s, fire control systems were upgraded and additional platforms were added to the foremast to accommodate them. And again in the 1930s, they were upgraded. A pair of directors were added in the 1930s, and the ship had a 32-foot 10-inch rangefinder installed at the top of the pagoda mast at the time. Type 21 air search radars were installed aboard the ship in mid-1942. Now let's look at the big guns. For her armament, she was equipped with 6 twin-mounted 14-inch guns, 16 single-mounted 5.5-inch guns, 4 twin-mounted 5-inch dual-purpose guns, and 10 twin-mounted 1-inch Type 96 anti-aircraft guns. She also had 6 21-inch torpedo tubes. She was incredibly well armed. She was launched on November 12, 1916, and then sent off to sea trials. She'd undergo sea trials and was completed on December 15, 1917, too late to join the war in World War I, and so instead, she'd move on to training and such. This was the beginning of a long career for Ise. And this is the beginning of a fun video for us. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comments section below. Okay, let's look at her career moving toward World War II. On August 29, 1920, Ise began the first of numerous patrols off the Siberian coast and in northern waters in support of Japan's Siberian intervention against the Bolshevik Red Army. The Siberian intervention was the 1918 to 1922 dispatch of troops of the Entente powers to the Russian maritime provinces as part of a larger effort by the Western powers, Japan, and China to support White Russian forces and the Czechoslovak Legion against the Bolsheviks. While at Yokohama on April 12, 1922, Ise hosted a delegation which included the Prince of Wales, or the future King Edward VIII, and his second cousin, the future Lord Mountbatten of Burma. This is quite the honor. Well, we'd moved toward tragedy in 1923. On Saturday, September 1st, 1923, at about 11:58 and 32 seconds in the morning, the 7.9 magnitude Great Kanto earthquake shook the Kanto Plain on the main Japanese island of Honshu. Varied accounts indicate the duration of the earthquake was between 4 and 10 minutes. After this, extensive firestorms and a fire whirl added to the death toll. It's estimated that between 105,358 and 142,800 were killed during this earthquake, and this includes 40,000 that went missing and were presumed dead later. It was a terrible tragedy for the nation of Japan, and so many innocents met a horrifying death. After the earthquake, Ise was deployed to bring supplies and aid survivors, a first-hand witness to the devastation. There's little information about her activities in the 1920s, but we do know she spent much of her time from the early 1920s through the later 1930s cruising off the coast of China. She did help sink the obsolete destroyer Yayoi during her gunnery training on August 10, 1926. She then underwent an overhaul from 1928 to 1929, during which her forward superstructure was enlarged and her flight facilities were upgraded. Beginning on August 1, 1935, Ise was dry-docked at Kure Naval Arsenal and underwent an extensive reconstruction and modernization that lasted up until March 23, 1937, which was the massive overhaul I mentioned earlier. On April 9, 1938, the ship began the first of her patrols off the southern coast during the Second Sino-Japanese War that lasted until early 1941. In some historical accounts, this is considered the beginning of the conflict in World War II, starting in China. China is often neglected in historical recollections, but not this time. She was transferred to the 2nd Division of the 1st Fleet on November 15, 1940, and became its flagship exactly 1 year later. Next, we get into the Pacific War. World War II's official start date began with Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, but the war in the Pacific would begin 2 years later. Ise would play her own role in the attack on Pearl Harbor. However, the main stars were of course the aircraft carriers of the Kido Butai attack force. To provide distant support for the 1st Air Fleet attacking Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the division, reinforced by the battleships Nagato and Mutsu, as well as the light carrier Hosho, sortied from Hashirajima to the Bonin Islands and returned 6 days later. The attack on Pearl Harbor would bring about the war in the Pacific, and the United States jumped into World War II with both feet. Ise had a minor refit at the Kure Naval Arsenal from February 19th to the 25th of 1942. Together with the rest of her division, she pursued and failed to catch the American carrier force that had launched the Doolittle raid on April 18, 1942. On May 11th, Ise had an accident and it flooded her No. 2 engine room. While she was under repair for this, she was fitted with one of the first experimental Type 21 early radar sets in the Imperial Japanese Navy. However, it was removed shortly after. Ise and the rest of the 2nd Battleship Division set sail on May 28, 1942, with the Aleutian Support Group at the same time most of the Imperial Fleet began an attack on Midway Island, or Operation MI. Commanded by Vice Admiral Shiro Takasu, this division was composed of Japan's 4 oldest battleships, 2 light cruisers, 2 oilers, and 12 destroyers. Official records do not show this division as part of the larger Midway operation, known as Operation AL. Instead, they were to accompany the fleet under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, but were only to provide support to the Aleutian Task Force if she was needed. The Battle of Midway was disastrous for the Japanese carrier forces, with 4 aircraft carriers being sunk here. This severely limited the ability of the Imperial Japanese Navy to conduct battle operations, and alternatives were sought. There were plans for full conversions of battleships into aircraft carriers, but they were rejected on the grounds of expense and, more critically, time. So, instead, the rear turrets from the Ise-class ships were removed and replaced with a flight deck equipped with 2 rotating catapults. She began her conversion on February 23, 1943, and her No. 5 and 6 turrets were replaced by a hangar surmounted by a flight deck. This was not long enough to permit the launch of aircraft or their recovery, so 2 catapults were installed and the existing crane was moved to the flight deck. The deck was fitted with an extensive system of rails to link each catapult, the storage positions on the deck, and the T-shaped aircraft lift that moved aircraft between the flight deck and the hangar. It had a capacity of 9 aircraft, the remainder being stowed on deck, and 1 on each catapult for a total of between 22 and 24. Let's look at her specs again briefly to see the changes. Now, she displaced 39,805 long tons fully loaded, and she was 720 feet 6 inches long, had a beam of 104 feet wide, and a draft of 29 feet 8 inches deep. At this point, her range was 9,500 nautical miles at 16 knots, and her complement averaged 1,463 officers and enlisted. For armament, she had 4 twin-mounted 14-inch guns, 8 twin-mounted 5-inch guns, 6 30-round 5-inch anti-aircraft rocket launchers, and 31 triple and 11 single-mounted 1-inch anti-aircraft guns. This rebuild was officially finished on October 8, 1943, and she made a sortie to truck later that month. On February 25, 1944, Battleship Division 2, along with Ise, was assigned to the direct control of the combined fleet. Ise and her sister ship Hyuga were transferred to the 3rd Fleet and assigned to the newly reformed 4th Carrier Division on May 1st. On June 23rd, the sisters conducted their first catapult training. Subsequent sessions were conducted on July 21st and August 31st. Moving forward into 1944, her next battle would be the battle off Cape Engano. Her end was coming near. But as a member, there's no end to the amazing perks. This episode couldn't be possible without our amazing YouTube members and patrons. Thank you all so much. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. Alright, it's time to look at the End of Ise. The aircraft of the 4th Carrier Division were ordered to prepare for combat by the commander of the Combined Fleet on October 10, 1944, following the Americans' attack on the Bonin Islands. 2 days later, the 634th Naval Air Group was reassigned to the 2nd Air Fleet and began flying to bases in southern Kyushu. Among them were 21 planes assigned to Ise and Hyuga. On October 14th, they attacked the aircraft carriers of Task Force 38 near Formosa. However, they had little effect and suffered heavy losses. The ships of the 4th Carrier Division were assigned to the main body of the 1st Mobile Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. The main body's task was to act as a decoy to attract attention away from the other 2 forces approaching from the south and west. All forces were to converge on Leyte Gulf on October 25th, and the main body departed Japan on October 20th. By dawn on October 24th, the main body was within range of the northernmost American carriers of Task Force 38, and Ozawa ordered an airstrike launched by the 3rd Carrier Division. It was round 2 against Task Force 38, and this accomplished little other than attracting attention as the Japanese aircraft could not get past the defending fighter pilots. The survivors of this attack landed at the airfield at Luzon. The Americans were preoccupied at this point, dealing with the other Japanese naval forces and defending themselves from air attacks from Luzon and Leyte, so they could not spare any planes to look for the Japanese carriers until the late afternoon. Finally, they were located, but Admiral William Halsey Jr. decided it was too late in the day to mount an effective strike. However, he did turn all of his ships north to position himself for a dawn attack on the Japanese carriers the following day. On the morning of October 25th, Ise was astern of the 2 carriers Zuikaku and Zuiho to protect them with her anti-aircraft guns. Her radar picked up American aircraft at a range of 125 nautical miles at 7:39 a.m. The first attack began at 8:20, with Ise launching Sanshiki anti-aircraft shells at the enemy from her main guns, but we don't know the effect of this. She was not heavily attacked, however 2 bombs did splash in the water near her. The second wave of aircraft attacked at 10:05 a.m., and the ship's gunners claimed to have shot down 5 of the 10 dive bombers. Ise was almost hit 8 times, and 1 small bomb hit the number 2 turret. The third wave was detected by her radar at 12:28 p.m., but it did not attack Ise, instead sinking the damaged Zuikaku and Zuiho. Ise rescued 98 survivors from Zuiho before the next attack hit at 5:26 p.m., and she was then the primary focus of this attack. She was attacked by about 85 dive bombers and 11 torpedo bombers. She was saved by heavy anti-aircraft fire and elite maneuvering, dodging every torpedo and only being struck by 1 bomb near the port catapult. Roughly 34 near misses damaged her hull plating near the waterline and started a small leak that contaminated a small oil tank and caused minor damage to the port boiler rooms. Splinters from near misses and the single hit killed 5 crewmen and wounded another 71. Just as the crew of Ise thought they were in the clear, at 5:42, the American submarine USS Halibut spotted the 4th Carrier Division and moved in to attack, missing with 6 torpedoes at 6:43. At 7 p.m., Ozawa ordered the ship south to defend the light cruiser Isuzu and her escorting destroyers that were attempting to rescue survivors of the crippled light carrier Chiyoda in the midst of fire from a group of 4 American cruisers. Ozawa was unable to locate either group of ships, instead ordering them to reverse course at 11:30 p.m. and to head to Anami Oshima to refuel. Despite the fact they were spotted by American submarines on the way, the division did make it safely on October 27th. They left the island the next day, being unsuccessfully attacked by the submarine USS Sea Dog before arriving at Kure on the 29th. Between October 29th and November 8th, the catapults were removed to improve the firing arcs of the No. 3 and 4 turrets. Ise and Hyuga departed on November 11th, loaded with troops and munitions to head to Manila. However, there were heavy American attacks on Manila, and the two ships were diverted to the Spratly Islands. They arrived on November 14th, and their cargo was unloaded to be transferred to the Philippines. They were transferred to the 2nd Fleet the next day and backed up by the battleship Haruna and 3 cruisers. The sisters moved to Linga Island on November 20th. They arrived on the 22nd and stayed until December 12th, leaving for French Indochina, where they were on standby on an attack on an American supply convoy bound for the island of Mindanao. The attack was cancelled on December 30th, and the ships headed to Singapore, arriving on January 1st, 1945, before heading back to Linga. That same day, the 4th Carrier Division was transferred to the Southwest Area Fleet. She set sail on her final mission on February 6th, heading to participate in Operation Kita at Singapore. While heading into Singapore, Ise was damaged by a mine that exploded. She was given temporary repairs, and afterward, she, Hyuga, and the light cruiser Oyodo were loaded with needed war supplies like oil, rubber, tin, zinc, and mercury, as well as 1,150 surplus oil workers to head to Japan. They then sailed from Singapore on February 10th, being spotted by the British submarine HMS Tantalus the following day. It was forced to submerge by a maritime patrol aircraft and was unable to attack Ise. On February 13th, the submarine USS Burgle unsuccessfully attacked the ships, as did the submarine USS Blower. One of Ise's AA guns caused one of Blower's torpedoes to detonate prematurely. Later that afternoon, Oyodo launched one of her float planes, which spotted USS Bashaw on the surface about 14 miles ahead of the convoy. Hyuga opened fire with her main guns and forced Bashaw to submerge when one of her shells splashed just 1 mile from the submarine. They reached Shanghai on the evening of the 15th after an unsuccessful submarine attack. The convoy reached Kure on February 20th, having evaded or escaped pursuit by 23 Allied submarines along the way. On March 1, 1945, the 4th Carrier Division disbanded, and Ise was reduced to first-class reserve. From this time until Japan surrendered, Ise sat at Kure, without fuel or aircraft, and repainted olive green camouflage with vari-colored splotches. The camo was not effective against American carrier-based aircraft from Task Force 58 on March 19th, when more than 240 planes bombarded Kure, and Ise was hit by 2 bombs. She was redesignated as a 4th-class reserve ship on April 20th, and she was towed to the island of Ondosetta to serve as a floating anti-aircraft battery. She was again attacked on July 24th by 60 carrier-based aircraft, whose bombs struck the starboard bow, flight deck, main deck, No. 3 turret, and bridge, killing Captain Mutaguchi Kakuro, other bridge personnel, and around 50 crewmen. Many others were wounded. The ship settled in the bow, and it took 3 days to pump her dry. The IJN planned to dry dock her for repairs, but she was struck by 5 1,000-pound bombs dropped by fighters from USS Hancock, and 11 more bombs dropped by other aircraft from TF-58 on July 28th. Later that day, an air attack by 18 United States Army Air Force heavy bombers was unsuccessful. Ise took on a 15-degree starboard list, sinking in shallow water. Salvage efforts were abandoned that same day, although some AA guns were stripped from the wreck. She was struck from the Navy Directory on November 20th, and the underwater portion of Ise was ignored until the following year. She'd be scrapped and placed by the Kure dockyard of the Harimazosen Corporation from October 9, 1946 to July 4, 1947, marking the end of a great Japanese battleship. Ise was an incredible battleship that did little during her career, similar to Yamato and Musashi. World War II was the ultimate test of battleship might, and in the end, the aircraft carrier came out on top. From this point onward, battleships began to be phased out, ending their reign on the seas. If you liked that story and wanted to hear something similar, check out our Imperial Japanese Warships playlist in the cards. Tune in next week for the story of the German U-boat U-869, one of the few U-boats discovered near the American East Coast. Thank you for tuning into Shipwreck Sunday, have a great week, and we'll see you next time.